Hello, welcome to Paranormal Newsdesk Ireland. My name is Caroline Barry, and today we are going to discuss aliens and the dead. So when I talk about aliens and the dead, you might think that that's a pretty new, incredibly weird idea, that you're seeing people who've been abducted on and are on UFOs have seen people that they know are dead and buried, but yet there they are living. So one of the first people that I kind of heard that from was Whitley Strieber. So Whitley Strieber, who wrote Communion and who popularized through cinema, through that and his book, the urban legend of alien abductions, about these grey beings coming into the room, abducting him and taking him up onto a spaceship. And he said he had heard accounts from abductees and experiencers who had seen people they knew to be dead on the ships. Now, I cannot find those sources. I have inputted every word combination I could into Google and they're not coming up. But I do have sources myself that talk about that experience. And I'm going to look at them in a little bit. I suppose one of the things that I'd like us to remember is that really when you look at Egyptian eschatological focus, when you look at their ceremonies around the dead, they are incredibly particular. They prepare the dead person to get on a ship, and that the ship is physically going to take them to an area just south of Orion called the Hidden Circle of the Duat. So they are really like, yeah, we're heading to outer space for our afterlife. And Whitley was talking to Jeffrey Mishlove very recently. They've done a great interview together. And they both discuss how when you're looking at the UFO experience, initially it seems to be all about high tech, but more and more that you dig into the subject matter, it's to do with the afterlife. And I'm going to go through some samples here to show you that actually something very peculiar is going on. So I have written a little article. It is called Aliens and the Dead. I'm not going to read the article. I'm just going to go through the points. So I started off with looking at Frederick Jurgenson's work. So I would have discussed this in the Strange Things Dead People Say in a previous podcast. But I really focused on his collecting information relating to spaceships, or telecraft, as he said, or UFOs, as he would have called them. So just a quick recap. Jurgenson was born in Odessa. He lived in Palestine. He eventually moved to Sweden. He was trained as a singer. He lost his voice through glandular fever, but he had an incredibly good ear. He became a painter, and he was a polyglot. He was able to speak 7 different languages. And that's really important because jamming signals is a very important thing that we need to focus on. He discovered, it was when he was out walking by a lake recording birdsong for a radio documentary in the late 1950s, around 1959, when the guy in Westmeath had his first experience of spaceships. When Jurgenson was out in Sweden collecting birdsong for a radio documentary, when he went home and he put on his earphones, he heard a very clear male voice say to him, "Friedrich, you are being observed." And he was obviously shocked because he had been down by the lake. He knew there was nobody in the area. He had recorded the bird songs, and yet here was this very clear voice telling him he was being observed. So, of course, Friedrich wondered, was the male voice observing him, or was the male voice warning him that somebody was looking at him? And then he became fascinated with the whole EVP, and he wrote an amazing book. Initially, he thought he was dealing with aliens from outer space, and he called the book Voices from Outer Space. And then he realized, no, this is the dead, because he began to record more and more voices, and he began to recognize the voices of deceased people that he knew. So he was really convinced, no, I am talking to dead people here. So he called his book, when he finally published his book of EVP, he called the book Voice Transmissions with the Deceased. So it's pretty straightforward and clear. I'm just going to watch. This cat is going to jump up any minute now. Right. So one of the first transmissions, or one of the really interesting transmissions relating to the dead here, that he actually, maybe I should talk a little bit about jamming signals first. He was a good radio hack, you know. So he was very aware of the jamming signals that the Russians were putting out, and I think the British. It was coming up on the Cold War, and he was very aware of the different jamming signals. And he talks about getting clean channels. He was really conscious that when he was working with collecting EVP, that he would have clean channels to work with. What he doesn't mention is, I think, the biggest jamming signal of all. The EVP that he was collecting was in several different languages. So a sentence might start in Spanish, move into German, head into English, and end in French. And because he was a linguist, he was able to thread all those different languages together and make a clear message. And it just got me thinking, he'd been working on that for ages. Finally, when he finished his book, he ended up inspiring Konstantin Raudova, who was a psychoanalyst lecturing in Uppsala University. And when Konstantin Raudova was collecting his electronic voice projections, when he was making contact with the dead, yet again, the dead were speaking to him in several different languages. And Konstantin Raudova had, I think it was 5 languages. So they were splicing together these disparate languages. And that just got me thinking about the story of the Tower of Babel. I had thought that the story of the Tower of Babel was literally just a biblical story. But when I researched it, I realized, it's a global myth. That this is enshrined in universal cultures, that are multiple cultures, that actually there was a desire to communicate with the gods, was the way it's usually described, but it could also be with people in the afterlife. And the gods got so angry that they destroyed the tower and divided the signal into several different tongues. Now, of course, the biblical variation of that, you'd have said, and that was how all the countries of the world spoke different languages. But I'd be more inclined to think that it's a really good description of a jamming process, and that is of relevance later. I suppose one of the things that I would like to say is when David Fravor was discussing seeing the Tic Tac UFO with Alex Friedman, he said that his communications were jammed 3 or 4 different ways. He said they were really disrupting his communications and making an incredible amount of frequency noise. So radar is terribly important. In fact, when Jurgenson talks about the team on the other side, the scientific team on the other side trying to contact him, they call the instrument that they're using radar. And they also set up a whole load of towers. And there's a whole load of caution around communicating with us, the living, for very, very strange reasons. So, aliens and the dead. Let's quickly move on. So when he was collecting his messages, I'm going to focus on, in particular, one friend of his called Hugo. And it's really moving when Jurgenson is describing Hugo's death. He's present when Hugo dies. And it's terribly upsetting. And when he calls these voices that contact him his friends, he sincerely believed he was contacting the dead. There's a whole theory out there that actually it's aliens cannibalizing the memory of a dead person's voice and using it to trick you, or it's another entity. This material is just so bizarre. I'm very aware of what I'm saying and it all sounding incredibly bizarre. But just to let you know that in the folklore around alien contact and around the contact with otherness is this whole idea of the hitchhiker or the imposter or something utilizing something close to you. It's kind of explored a little bit in that film, that Sagan film Contact, where the alien takes on the apparition of Jodie Foster's father, that they seem to have a shape-shifting ability. And Jurgenson really seems to take them at face value. He really trusts that he's talking to the dead. He sincerely does not believe that there is anything nefarious or dark or any kind of trickery or trickster element going on. And I don't know if that is a broadness of spirit or a complete knowingness within himself, that he's some kind of Gnostic knowledge that actually, yes, he was in direct contact with deceased loved ones. He certainly did analyse, was he schizoid or was he schizophrenic, and was very clear. He felt very satisfied that he wasn't. He felt, yes, well, I haven't lost it in any other area of my life, and I'm not displaying any kind of strange schizophrenic tendencies outside of, and also I have the proof because there's strange sounds on my tape recorder. Again, these sounds have a kind of an infra quality to them. They're either very, very slow and need to be speeded up, or they're very, very fast and need to be slowed down. And that, again, these frequencies outside of the band of our normality is not unusual. Anyway, back to Hugo. Hugo dies. He seems to have been a lovely man. He was a friend of Jurgenson's, I think quite sickly for most of his life. He has a very tragic death. He passes over to the other side. Frederick starts to collect these electronic voice phenomena, and in the process of collecting them, he makes friends with people on the other side. Not people he might have directly known, but people who inform him sometimes. If he can't speak directly to the person he's known, these voices inform him about people he's known. So the voices inform him, or his friends inform him about Hugo. So let's see what they say. I'm going to quote directly what they say. The voices say, Hugo knows facts. Hugo is doing good. Hugo is examining moon satellites. Hugo is making space flights. Hugo is examining a nuclear plant. So the whole idea of examining nuclear plants was known pretty early on. So Jurgenson would have known this. It just seems so bizarre that, and a little bit worrying. So Hugo seems to have been conscripted into engineering and technical work now that he's in the afterlife. This idea of the other world somehow mirroring ours is not unusual. It usually never is an unrecognizable afterlife. It usually tends to be not dissimilar to the world that we're in or the technology that we're in. And if you look at the work of the mystic Emanuel Swedenborg, who I'll be talking about in a moment, his world is the world of the 18th century. He doesn't talk about cars or rockets. He talks about horses and carriages and meeting houses and taverns. He also talks about mirror cities. So you have real London and then you have afterlife London. And that does seem to come up as a motif, that somehow this physical world is mirrored in the next life, but not quite. There's something off. Anyway, Hugo seems to be conscripted and he's off looking at moon satellites. Now, the thing that I find troubling is we don't know if Hugo is doing it of his own volition. We never hear from Hugo. So, I mean, I'm smiling because I'm here kind of going, this is a dead man. And now he's to go off and look at moon satellites and check out nuclear power plants. But because we're back to this very strange phenomena, I will discuss it, you know, because it needs to be, it is in the mix. You know, we have folkloric testimony, we have modern testimony, and people, of course, nobody believes it because we're in shock. We're 70 years on from the Second World War, we're 100 years on and more from the First World War. So we're spiritually really depressed and we are material reductivists. We tend to, in the main, we tend to worry that there's nothing after we die. So to suddenly kind of feel there's aliens about and you might still have to work when you die isn't very palatable to me. But anyway, there you go. So Hugo is in these ships. he's on these UFOs, and it has been communicated to Jurgenson that this is happening, that Hugo is on a UFO and he's checking out moon satellites and he's checking out nuclear power plants. So the next piece of direct quote that Jurgenson says the dead tell him, I suppose the thing that I also find worrying about that last quote is Hugo is doing good. Hugo is making space flights. I mean, that's pretty on the nose. There's no subterfuge there. It's straightforward. Hugo's in space. And he's checking moon satellites and he's examining a nuclear plant. I don't know what anybody can do with that information, except maybe allow it to melt your brain a little and maybe melt your resistance a little and kind of go, okay, this is really odd. And of course it can all be dismissed as the most hilarious, silly imagination. Or it's just a strange, maybe it's true, I don't know. What I found a bit worrying is that the voices prior to saying that Hugo is good and he's doing all of this, they say Hugo was a good human. Hugo was so undemanding. He was so humane. And I find there's a little bit too much of a subtext in there for me that I'm kind of a little bit worried. You know, what do they mean Hugo was undemanding? And is he very compliant now? And maybe should Hugo maybe resist and be a bit more demanding? And is he being held against his will? And is he being made to examine moon satellites against his will? I don't know. Anyway, Dr. Colin Kelleher would say here now, when you listen to him, he's the biochemist who works on Skinwalker Ranch, he would say, look, there's always a trickster element involved. And I suppose the longer that I explore this subject matter, and I've been doing it now for a good few years, I would have been quite excited about the idea of, oh, you meet an alien, you know, and wouldn't that be amazing and broaden your cultural horizons? Whereas now I'm really worried that there is, I'm really worried that there is a malevolent aspect to this that I hadn't quite considered before. Anyway, so the dead voices often called Frederick or Friedel. And here they say, Frederick, we're flying. Friedel, we're sitting in the ship of the dead. So the ship of the dead, now if anything smacks of Egyptian lore, it's the ship of the dead, you know. As you know, the Egyptians had anatomized the human being into several parts. So you have the outer layer of the physical, then you have another layer in which is, I have it here in my book, you have the lighter physical body, you have it's a bit like the Indian koshas. The koshas are the same. You have the mental layer, you have the physical layer, you have the emotional layer. I just want to see here now what they had. They're kind of psychological layers, but basically anyway, they splinter after death. And a lot of the ceremonies that the Egyptians would have engaged in, here they are. You have the physical body, the spiritual body, the heart, the ka, which is the vital body, the ba, which is the personality, the shit, which is the shadow, and the ankh, which is the intellect. So to prevent you from dissolving and splintering into all those parts, I think you had a ceremony. Now, I'm not an Egyptologist, but my memory, if it serves me right, you went through a ceremony called the opening of the mouth. And that was really preparing you to get onto the ship of the dead and to keep your consciousness intact. You'll go through a series of trials and you'll meet a series of tribulations, but your destination is the hidden circle of the Jewett, and the hidden circle of the Jewett has a definite geographical place just a little bit south of Orion, very close to Orion, the star constellation. So it's really curiously metaphysical on the one hand, and then strangely practical and geographically located and orientated on the other hand. So they're on the ship of the dead. And you know, the ship of the dead is an old motif that goes straight through to medieval times. He said that the ship, you know, here today it would appear the dead are turning up in alien aircraft. Jurgenson went on to say that he recorded several times the word tele-ship and craft. Now that's interesting because the word tele, as we know, means travelling over long distances, and teleshift or craft. So Jurgenson was recording UAPs or UFOs in his book. But he didn't spend an awful lot of time with them because he had come to the conclusion that he wasn't dealing with aliens in the end. And he was much more fascinated by the idea that we stayed alive after we died. We did have another life, and we were tasked with things, and we had duties and responsibilities. And so he focused a lot on that. So the next person that I really wanted to look at who speaks about aliens and the dead is Emanuel Swedenborg. Now, I appreciate that none of this has any proof, that this is just testimony. But I suppose what happens with testimony is you gather testimony from enough different sources and disparate sources, you can start to piece together a picture. And whether that picture is a psychological picture or an actual real collage of reality, nobody knows. Nobody knows. I mean, the story at the moment with regard to UAPs is that we don't know what's going on, and that there is attendant paranormal experiences that happen with UAPs or UFOs that really material reductivists don't want anything to do with. They're having a hard time even recognizing that there might be UAPs that aren't our tech, you know. Anyway, so the next person I want to talk about is Emanuel Swedenborg. He was a son of a bishop from Sweden, which is kind of handy, so you remember his name. He was not interested in religion. He decided to become a mineralogist. He was a scientist. He was a miner. He was head of the mines I don't know what they were digging up in Sweden on behalf of the royalty of Sweden. He was a member of parliament. Again, he was a polyglot. He was a linguist. He could speak several languages. And I think he was quite pleasure-seeking when he was younger. I think he had a hedonistic enough lifestyle when he was younger, or a younger man, but very well educated, but he had status. And then in his 50s, he had a series of what he called preternatural dreams. And to us, preternatural would mean supernormal. They may even mean lucid, but he would insist it was beyond lucid. They were so tactile and real that in fact he felt he truly experienced them and he lived them. I would associate the word preternatural with fearful and kind of scary, as well as having supernatural content. And he began to talk about meeting with dead neighbours and friends and speaking to them. And they would report to him that they were now in this other life. And more and more and more, he began to experience this afterlife. And he ended up writing up really an amazing amount of material. There's a fantastic doctor, Dr. David Rose from the Swedenborgian Society, who broadcasts along with Curtis. I've forgotten Curtis's surname, and they give very interesting analysis of Swedenborg's writings. Now, the thing that I find less appealing about Swedenborg is that he tends to constantly reinterpret the Bible. To him, the Bible was telling a lot of stories that could be reinterpreted symbolically. But the interesting thing about Swedenborg is that he wasn't overtly religious, which seems odd. It was more that his experiences open up a really unusual afterlife. And in fact, those that have had near-death experiences kind of mirror aspects of Swedenborg's writings that now make you wonder, oh, perhaps Swedenborg was really experiencing something pretty authentic. I mean, I think he was. I think he was a very unusual. He had a very detached way of approaching things. He didn't get very upset about the fact that he was having these amazing experiences. He was talking to angels. He was talking to demons. He was talking to dead people. He gives the most fascinating accounts that eventually we all end up on a frequency level and in a community that operate by the same frequency that we do. And the usual message that he gives is the same as all NDE experiencers, which is we are here to love and we are here to love. So he wrote a book in 1758 called De Telurbius in Mundo Solari, Earths in Our Solar System. And in it, he said, there is a plurality of worlds and humankind exists not just on one earth, but on countless earths. So he believed that we were proliferated throughout the universe. But not only that, he said, in the other life, meaning the afterlife, it is common knowledge that there are many planets with people on them. A love of truth prompts people there to want to talk with spirits from the other worlds. He asserts there is indeed a plurality of worlds and humankind exists. So he said, look, there's aliens in the afterlife and you're going to meet them. And that was in 1758. Fast forward to 1990s and to Scole in England. There's an amazing film called The Afterlife Investigations on YouTube, and you should check it out because that talks about the Scole's experiment. Now, the Scole's experiment was run by a set of mediums for 5 years, and they were independently observed by different people, and they had invited in different scientists. Included would be Dr. Rupert Sheldrake from Cambridge University or Oxford, one of those luminous universities. There were pretty decent people observing what was going on. And in the Scole's experiment, they did a thing called Project Alice. And Project Alice involved setting up a video camera, putting the video camera in front of a mirror, and a medium would go and sit down. They did this both with the lights on and the lights off. And a medium would go and sit in front of the mirror and scree, this ancient or scrine, this ancient. It's Raymond Moody does it now in a darkened room with mirrors. He calls it, it's an ancient Grecian form of getting in contact with the dead and the afterlife. And it involves staring into mirrors and usually in the dark. But in this Project Alice one, they did it in the dark and in light. And they captured pretty amazing material, including a bluish alien. Now, it looks like your typical almond-eyed, large grey, but there's a bluish tinge to the skin, and they call the alien blue. There's a kind of a date stamp on it of 1998, and that's pretty eerie to look at, that it suddenly drifts across the screen, supposedly instrumental transcommunication from the afterlife. Supposedly it is footage from the afterlife. And then they also captured another, he's a very, I think it's a very eerie doll-like looking alien with these kind of, almost looks like a puppet, rolling kind of eyes back and forth, and blackish hair, which made me think of the description from one of the Zimbabwe children many years ago when they were being interviewed by Dr. John E. Mack from Harvard University. They talked about an alien having long, scraggy, black hair. So the Scole's experiment which was very focused on the life after death. That was the whole point of the Scole's experiment. They wrote a book. I think I have the book here. It's on the floor over there. And they get a whole load of writing and messages, and they have extraordinarily strange phenomena happen, including tiny little orbs erupting in the seance room, or the Scole hole, as they used to call it, with them. So again, you're getting aliens in the afterlife.
And today we're going to explore two of the biggest mysteries confronting the human race today. We're going to look and see if they aren't related to each other. I'm talking about the mystery associated with aliens and UFOs and the mystery associated with life after death, the afterlife. So the topic is titled Aliens in the Afterlife. And there's good reason to think that these topics overlap, and I know a lot of it has to do with some of your earliest research with the PK man, Ted Owens. That's right. Thank you for bringing it up. Now, I know many of our viewers have actually read the PK man, and I've done, I don't know, half a dozen or more interviews about it out of the 1,000 or so that are on the New Thinking Aloud channel. But let me summarize. I did a 10-year field study with a man named Ted Owens, who explained himself to me as a UFO abductee, contactee, a person whose brain had been operated on by aliens to give him enormous power greater than any human has ever exercised since the days of Moses. And he explained that he didn't just explain. No, he demonstrated. I have in my files 160 examples of these demonstrations. About 100 of them, I would say, or more, pretty much worked out the way he said they would. He showed a large-scale psychokinetic effects, which he claimed were mediated because of his telepathic communication with what he called the space intelligences. And we're talking about hurricanes, tornadoes, earthquakes, large-scale power blackouts, droughts, ending droughts typically, not causing them. But if he got angry at people, there could be waves of lightning strikes. Lightning was another one of his specialties. Now, this all has a lot to do with alien intelligences. In fact, UFO sightings are part of the signatures that accompany his demonstrations. And I've talked about this a great deal on New Thinking Aloud in the past. I'm not going to repeat it now. What I want to talk about is the relationship between the space intelligences and the afterlife. And it has to do with Ted Owens' death. He died in 1987, living in a small town in upstate New York, Fort Anne. Before he died, he wrote to me and explained that the space intelligences wanted him to move to Fort Anne for some reason. Well, there's been a lot of UFO activity in upstate New York. Whitley Strieber, who I'll be talking about, for example, had his major encounters in that area. Before he died, Owens wrote to me and indicated that there were aliens, ships, and strange lights hovering right over the farmhouse where he was living. And in fact, there were articles in the local newspaper about it, and a letter of testimonial from his neighbor saying, yeah, he saw these lights directly over Owens' farmhouse. Owens said, yes, they've come to merge with me. And within a few weeks, he died. So that was a hint to me that there's some relationship. Now, there's a big mythology, of course, relating UFOs to the afterlife. There was the incident of the Bo and Peep. I know there's another name for it, but when the comet Kohoutek came along, there were mass suicides by people who were under the misguided impression, I think, that a UFO was trailing along behind the comet and it was going to pick them up, and they committed suicide so they could meet the UFO. Well, what that tells us is that there is some overlap between authentic spiritual communication, and I have to put it bluntly, delusion. I would never ever recommend people commit suicide in the expectation that they'll be picked up by aliens in a UFO. And of course, there were no UFOs accompanying the Kohoutek comet unless they were of the type that Ted Owens talked about, invisible ones. But that, I don't think, is what they thought. At the time, there was, I think, a photograph that had been published that implied erroneously that there was some sort of UFO hanging out with this comet. But that delusion aside, there are other examples. Well, let's get into the other examples. This is beginning to be quite interesting. Let me talk, for example, about a recent interview that was released on the New Thinking Aloud channel, probably a week before I released this one, with Robin Foy. If you haven't watched that, I am going to link to it right now. You can click on it. It's fascinating. Robin Foy is the founder of the Scole group and the founder of the Noah's Ark Society, two organizations that brilliantly pioneered the use of physical mediumship to produce effects that astonished researchers from the Society for Psychical Research. But in this interview, he talks about, and it's near the beginning, he talks about an example of a physical medium in 2007 who came to visit him where he's now living in Spain and materialized the whole crew of spirit guides who are working with his team. And of course, these spirit guides are essentially discarnate humans, but he said amongst them was an alien, an extraterrestrial, who has been working with them as a spirit guide since the days of the Scole group, which is some 25 years ago. So there is another connection. There you have an alien in the midst of a group of discarnates. Now, Whitley Strieber, in his book, Communion, reports this amazing incident in which he's having sex with an alien, a visitor, an extraterrestrial with the big almond eyes. And he reports that in the same room with him, there were people watching them having sex. One of them was a person he knew had died. So now you have a discarnate amongst the aliens. So there seems to be a lot of overlap. Fascinating. Do you have another example? Indeed, I do. Now, a few weeks before this video has been released, I also released a fascinating study, a really fascinating study, an interview with Roy Stemmen, who worked for decades with George Chapman, a medium and a healer who manifested the persona, or one might say the spirit, of Dr. William Lang for a period of 6 decades. Now, the interesting thing here is that Dr. Lang, and in the book that Chapman wrote with Roy Stemmen, it's called Surgeon from Another World, meaning the afterlife, but he talks about his communication with a scientist in England named John Best. John Best has written a book. I'm going to post the book cover now. I think it's called Links and Communique. And in it, John Best talks about his many encounters with William Lang through the mediumship of George Chapman. But he also talks about his deceased fiancée, Marjorie. That's mostly what the book is about. And Marjorie is communicating to him. He's receiving regular messages, evidential messages from her in the afterlife. And she's describing her experiences in the afterlife. She was a nurse, as I recall, in her physical existence. And in the afterlife, she has the job of visiting various hospitals and situations that a nurse is called for, and they've given her a vehicle. And the vehicle that he describes is very much like what you'd think of as a flying saucer. It can travel thousands of miles an hour on the planet, and even faster if she goes off planet. So here we have what could be a credible instance of a UFO being piloted within the afterlife.